on, chapter 13. So this chapter, like I said, we're talking about quasi experiments. So how do these differ from true experiments, which we talked about previously, and how well or how do they support causal claims at all? And then small n designs. So these two are very separate, different things, not really go together at all, but small n designs. How does a small n design differ from a large n design? N just being the number of participants in the study. And then how can we use small n designs to support causal claims? So two parts of the chapter really could be two different chapters, but there's, I guess, not enough information in either. So for quasi experiments, we're going to talk about independent group quasi experiments and repeated measures quasi experiments. These should look familiar to you already. We've talked about them numerous times. So independent groups, remember, is when the participants who are in each group are different, right? So if you have 4 different groups that you're looking at, you have separate individuals in each of those different groups. Repeated measures is when the same participants are participating in all the groups, right? So if you have 4 different levels of the independent variable, whatever that may be, the same people are doing all 4 levels. Okay, so there's quasi experiments both that have independent group design and a repeated measure design. So we'll talk about examples of each of those. Talk about internal validity and quasi experiments, how to balance priorities, different types of validity, and then comparing quasi experiments to correlational studies because they are pretty similar. Okay, so a quasi experiment, first before we, I guess, get going, quasi experiments aren't true experiments, obviously. So what's happening in a quasi experiment is the independent variable is not actually being manipulated. So there's still going to be an independent variable. There's going to be multiple levels of that independent variable, but the researchers aren't actually going to be manipulating that. So in a quasi experiment, we are measuring one level of the independent variable and then comparing that to different dependent variables. So it's kind of correlational, but how it's set up is a little bit different. Okay, so if we're looking at independent group quasi experiments, well, there's 2 examples we're going to go through. So we have psychological effects of walking by a church and psychological effects of cosmetic surgery. So those 2 examples are both using a non-equivalent control group design. So there are different participants or groups at each level of the independent variable. There's at least one treatment group in this type of design and one comparison or control type group. But again, unlike an actual experiment, the participants aren't going to be randomly assigned to groups. The researchers aren't manipulating the independent variable. In both cases, in all cases of non-equivalent control group designs, the researchers are just looking at what levels of the independent variable are present, doing their best to randomly select people who are already in those groups. Okay, so the first example, psychological effects of walking by a church. So for this study, researchers approached 99 people who either were passing by a religious landmark or a non-religious landmark. So religious would be like some sort of church or whatever, non-religious, literally anything else, a city building, something like that. So just people who were walking by, not entering or leaving different buildings, but just walking in front of the buildings. So researchers, again, approached these 99 people. They selected people systematically and approached people who were passing by. I already said that. I'm reading my notes here. And then they just had each person complete a short questionnaire about their religious views, political views, and attitude towards a variety of different social groups, different demographics of people. So Christians, foreigners, Arabic people, African people, also gay individuals they were asked about as well. I talked about that in the book, but I guess it's not on here. So the independent variable here is what they were walking by. So either they're walking by a religious building or a non-religious building, right? There's 2 levels of the independent variable. And then the dependent variable was the attitudes for different things that were measured, right? So it's a quasi-experiment because researchers didn't tell people to walk by certain buildings, so they weren't controlling the independent variable, they weren't manipulating that. They were just decided what they wanted their independent variable to be, and then found people who met that criteria. And they did the best they could to have it a systematic sample, so randomly, to try to, randomize it as best as they could, but still they weren't completely in control of the experiment. And they did find differences. So, walking by the religious building, belief in God, 54% compared to 46%, and all of the numbers, their warmth towards different types of people who are walking by religious landmarks, was lower than non-religious landmarks, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, again, quasi-experiment because the independent variable was not actually being manipulated, right? Okay. The second example, again, this is a non-equivalent control group design with independent groups. So each group is different people who are participating. This study is looking at the psychological effects of cosmetic surgery. So the researchers wanted to compare self-esteem of people who underwent cosmetic surgery compared to people who didn't have cosmetic surgery. So what they did, they went to a cosmetic surgery clinic, or whatever you want to call it, and had a treatment group that had people who underwent cosmetic surgery, and then a comparison group was people who registered at the same plastic surgery office. So they indicated they were interested but never went through with the surgery. Right, so there's two groups of the independent variable, those who had surgery, and the comparison group of individuals who were interested in it, but never underwent the surgery. And the researchers surveyed both participants at multiple points in time, so it was a pre-test, post-test design. So at baseline on self-esteem, life satisfaction, and then general attractiveness. At baseline, and then 3, 6, and 12 months later, and compare the surgery group compared to the comparison group. Again, a quasi-experiment because their researchers aren't actually manipulating the independent variable. They're not randomly assigning participants to be in the surgery or non-surgery group, right? People are self-selecting. They're either going for the surgery or not. So it is not a true experimental setup. But we do have the independent variable, and then the dependent variable would be the self-rating on these different measures. Again, this would be a pre-test, post-test, an example of a non-equivalent control group design. Non-equivalent because we do have a control group, but it's not necessarily, the same random assignment as you would see in a actual experiment. And your book talks a little bit more about the findings and stuff of these studies, but as long as you understand why it's not an actual experiment, you should be fine. So this is a pre-test, post-test. I didn't mention it in this one. This would just be a post-test design because people walked by whatever building it was, and then they were asked about these things, right? They weren't asked about their belief in God and the warmth towards other people before they walked by the building. So this would be a post-test only design. Okay, so those are both examples of independent groups, right, where different people were making up both of the groups. We can also have examples of repeated measures, quasi-experiments. So we have two examples we're going to talk about. The first is looking at food breaks and parole decisions, which is considered an interrupted time series design. And then we have assessing the impact of healthcare laws, which is kind of a mix of the two different designs. So it's a non-equivalent control group interrupted time series design. So literally just both of the names smushed together because it's kind of a combination of both things. Okay, and your book has definitions of these types of designs, but as long as you kind of understand what they're talking about and what examples. If it's an example of repeated measure or independent, then you should be good. So the first study looking at food breaks and parole decisions, again, an interrupted time series design that was a repeated measure. So basically, the study assessed the proportion of favorable parole decisions made by judges before and after food breaks. So they had judges, I forget where this was at. It was in Israeli prisons. And in general, paroles rejected 65% of the time on average. But researchers wanted to see if the time of day or time compared to a break affected decision. Typically, you would hope that this wouldn't affect parole decisions. You hope everyone has kind of an equal chance of getting parole, but this was, I guess, not the case. So researchers found, so this would be the time of day, so you would have parole cases, the judge would hear them throughout the day, and then these dotted lines are when the judge had a food break. And then this is the proportion of favorable decisions on the y-axis. So the higher on the y-axis, the more likely someone was to get parole. Right, so you can see, beginning of the day, the judges were more likely to grant parole. This decreased throughout the day until the food break. After the food break, the chance of getting parole increased dramatically, again, slowly declined. After another food break, same thing. So you can see that throughout the day, there was some sort of fatigue going on where the judge was less likely to grant parole, but the chances of getting parole after the food break obviously was a lot higher. So if you're ever trying to get parole, I don't know if you have any say in a schedule, but try to get at the beginning of the day or right after some sort of food break or lunch break, whatever it may be. Again, this is a quasi experiment because researchers aren't actually assigning people, the judges, to do this, right? The judges are just living out their lives, and researchers are looking at the independent variable, so how close to the food break it was, and then measuring the proportion of favorable decisions. Interrupted time series, time design, right, throughout the day, and interrupted because you have these different breaks here, and repeated measure because it's one individual or a group of judges. They found the average, so it's a bunch of judges, the average, but they were all part of both of the independent variable groups. So at the beginning, close to the food breaks or start of the day, and then later on in the day. Okay, so again, not a true experiment, wasn't actually being manipulated. It was just kind of being measured by researchers. And then the other example of a repeated measure design is assessing impact of healthcare laws. So this, again, is considered a non-equivalent control group interrupted time series design. Control group because we are comparing, well, in this case, individuals who live in Massachusetts compared to neighboring states. So we have a control group, non-equivalent though because you're not assigning people into groups. It's kind of self-selected and you're just measuring whatever the dependent variable is for each group. And then time series design because again, you're looking at a continuation of time and looking at the change over time. Okay. So this study was looking at, again, the impact of healthcare laws on ability of people to see doctors, to have insurance, or to, forgo medical care because they don't have insurance. In 2010, federal government enacted the Affordable Care Act, which required all citizens to acquire health insurance or they were going to face fines. 4 years prior to that, a similar policy was enacted in one state only, which was Massachusetts. So researchers wanted to see if this law made a difference in people's access to healthcare, right? So ideally, the point of this is so people have better access to healthcare, but researchers wanted to see if that was actually the case. So they acquired data from 178,000 non-elderly adults. Some of them were from Massachusetts, some of them were from neighboring states. So Massachusetts had this healthcare law in place. Neighboring states obviously at this point did not. And they had people complete a survey asking whether they had insurance at all, if they had a personal doctor, and if they have gone without medical care because they couldn't afford it. So you can see this is just looking at the percentage unable to see a doctor due to cost. So at the start, they're pretty similar. When the Massachusetts healthcare law was put in place in 2006, after that, Massachusetts percentage unable to see a doctor due to cost was significantly lower than the neighboring states. Right, so this is showing that Massachusetts, Stella, had better access to healthcare due to this law, is what the study is trying to say. Again, it's a quasi experiment because you're not actually assigning people into groups. You're not manipulating this independent variable. You're just looking at people who are already in these groups and then comparing the dependent variables of those individuals. And we'll talk about the ability of this to be like supporting a causal claim. Is this healthcare law actually what's causing this better care in Massachusetts, or is it something else that's going on? Okay, and that has a lot to do with the internal validity. Stella, you can stop barking. Okay. Okay, so internal validity, all of this stuff we've talked about before, all of these yellow terms, so these should all be familiar to you. If they're not, you need to go back and review this stuff. The book does a pretty good job of giving a lot of examples of all these different types of threats and effects. I would recommend in your notes going through and making sure you have like a good definition of all of these from previous chapters. And then basically we're just applying stuff we already know to quasi experiments. So it should be pretty straightforward if you already know it. Just being able to look, at the different type of internal validity threat or whatever it may be and apply it to some sort of quasi experiment. So typically quasi experiments, because they're not actually manipulating the independent variable, you're not controlling for a lot of these different things. Quasi experiments typically have not as great of internal validity as an actual experiment. So performing a quasi experiment, you're giving up some internal validity, and all of these things are going to be more likely to be seen in a quasi experiment compared to an actual experiment. Okay, so the same threats that you would see for an actual experiment, but due to the design, of a quasi experiment, you're more likely to have these affecting compared to actual experiments. Okay, so the first, selection effects. So this threat has to do with unaccounted for differences between groups. So it's only relevant to independent group designs and not a repeated measure, right? So it's differences between groups. So if you have one group that does all the different conditions, obviously this doesn't matter, okay? So in the cosmetic surgery example, is there selection effects? Is there differences between the people who underwent cosmetic surgery and those who didn't? So the book talks about an example. A lot of the people who decided not to get cosmetic surgery did so because they couldn't afford it, right? So right there's a difference between your control group and your surgery group, right? So that's considered a selection effect. So we don't know if the results of how pretty they think they looked, is that actually due to the cosmetic surgery? Is it due to some other selection effect? Have people having more money, just are happier in general, so they have a higher well-being score, something like that. A way to get rid of this issue is to create matched groups, which we've already talked about. So take researchers did this. They took into account several demographic variables: age, gender, BMI, and income, to try to make the two groups as similar as possible, except for the independent variable. Okay, design confounds is extraneous variables that influence the results of the study. Excuse me. So for the parole example, what if the prisoners who went before the judges right after lunch varied systematically? So if maybe right in the morning and right after lunch, there just so happened to be less severe cases that were being reviewed, that would be a design confound. If you have systematic differences in that example at different times of the day between, the people who are up for parole. And again, you can control for this. You just have to make sure that you're going through and looking at, the participants and different extraneous variables, and making sure you're ruling those other confounds out. Okay. Maturation threat. If the pretest and a post-test, maybe a change emerged just because spontaneously over time things change. So in the plastic surgery example, maybe people rated themselves as being prettier and happier later on because just naturally they felt more confident as they got older, something like that, right? So it had nothing to do with the plastic surgery, just over time, people got happier with the way that they looked. A way to control for maturation threat is with a control group, right? So which that study did have people who did not undergo surgery. Because you would see if there's a maturation threat, you would expect to see that with both the control group and the group who underwent surgery. So because we had a control group, we can kind of rule out a maturation threat. And then the last threat on this slide, at least, is the history threat, which occurs when an external historical event happens for everyone in the study at the same time as the treatment. So a good example that one of this might affect is that Massachusetts health insurance study. So maybe, people had better access to healthcare because the affordability just approved, and it wasn't necessarily due to this healthcare law that was enacted, right? And that would change for everybody. So how do we know for sure that there was, differences due to the actual law? And again, like the maturation threat, having a control group can account for that, because you can see if there's a historical event, it would occur for everyone, not just people in Massachusetts. It would occur for the control group as well. So you can see all of these pretty straightforward. If you know what they are, they kind of make sense. And you can see how in a quasi experiment, these things might be more, more likely to happen if we can't control for everything quite as well, can't do random assignment. It's quite likely that we're going to see some of these threats in a quasi experiment. Okay, some more threats. So first we have regression to the mean, which basically in the pre-test post-test design, at the first measure there was some extreme case of something happening that caused everyone to rate higher or lower, either way. And then at the second test, the post-test, people got back to normal, so it looks like there's a change, but actually the first test was just skewed. Again, having a comparison group can rule this out. Attrition threat is when there's a pre-test and post-test as well, but people systematically drop out of the study. So in the plastic surgery example, maybe a lot of people who didn't go through with the plastic surgery dropped out because they weren't confident, or people who did go through with the plastic surgery but weren't confident and felt, bad about themselves. Maybe they were really tired of answering questionnaires about how pretty they thought they were, so they all happened to drop out. which would affect, the results if they're systematically dropping out. Again, the same as we talked about before, making sure that you do analyses to see if the dropouts are systematic in any way, and trying to control for that. Testing and instrumentation threats. So whenever the participants are measured more than once, you want to make sure that the tests are consistent, and instrumentation, whatever you're using to do your measures, are measuring the same way multiple times. Again, having control groups, comparison groups, helps with that. And then finally, observer bias, demand characteristics, and placebo effects, all things that kind of have to do with human subjectivity. So knowing that, you're taking some sort of pill, reporting something because you think that it's doing whatever it may be doing. Demand characteristics, when you think, for example, let's go to the next slide. In the cosmetic surgery group, maybe they're individuals who got surgery, reported feeling more attractive because they expected the surgery to make them look better. They thought that that's what was, gonna happen. So it could be like some sort of placebo, or when they're rating themselves, they know they're being asked about, their attractiveness because they just got plastic surgery, so they're more likely to answer in a way that makes, supports what the researchers believe, right? So that's a huge threat, especially in these quasi experiments. And ways to get rid of this is to do blind experiments, double blind experiments. So the researchers and the participants don't know which group they're in. Obviously, a little bit more difficult to do in some of these situations, but if researchers could find a way to still look at these two groups of people, but kind of mask how they got the groups, so not necessarily let people know that they know they're in the cosmetic surgery group or the non-cosmetic surgery group. So the participants don't necessarily know that has anything to do with their cosmetic surgery. That might help get rid of some of these subjectivities. Okay. Oh, this chapter is long. Balancing some priorities. So all quasi experiments are good and beneficial because we're using real world opportunities to gather information, and utilizing things that we might not necessarily normally be able to study. This helps with external validity extremely. If we're already looking at people in real world settings, we're, already can say that this generalizes to the real world because we're already looking at the real world, right? So although internal validity is compromised slightly, our external validity in quasi experiments is typically better. Ethics. Obviously, using quasi experiments is a good idea sometimes because we might not necessarily be able to do the experiments ethically if we were to do a true experiment. We can't assign random people to have cosmetic surgery. We can't give people certain health care and tell them other people they can't have that health care. No, we do. But like ethically speaking, these studies that we're doing that are quasi experiments, we would not be able to do otherwise. So using real world opportunities again is very beneficial because we can do things that we might not necessarily be able to study otherwise. And then finally, construct validity and statistical validity. You guys already know what those are. Construct validity, how well things are operationalized. Typically in quasi experiments, the independent variables are very well operationalized, right? If you're looking at people who got plastic surgery or didn't, or people who are walking by a religious landmark or not, it's pretty cut and dry, what the different groups are. So manipulation of independent variable typically is not an issue. But it's really important, again, that we look at the dependent variable construct validity and make sure the questions that we're asking are actually asking what we want them to be. And then statistical validity, like all experiments, it's important to look at if the results we get are significant, looking at the effect size, all of that stuff we talked about previously still applies here in quasi experiments. Okay. And then final thing about quasi experiments, are they the same as correlational studies? So we talked about a correlational study looking at associations between two variables, and in a lot of cases, these are pretty similar. So both may use independent group designs, and these independent group designs, quasi experiments, are more similar to the correlational studies than our repeated measure. So we're really just talking about independent group designs here. But both don't use random assignment, right? So they're just looking at people in their natural habitat, if you will, and then measuring, different levels of different other variables. So they're not randomly assigning, and they're not manipulating variables at all, right? So in both cases, you don't have true independent variables that the researchers are taking and manipulating. So they're pretty similar, right? The really only difference and why these are considered different, I suppose, is that quasi experiments use techniques such as active selection to seek out individuals that fit the independent variable levels that they're looking for, right? So a correlational study, you might have a survey that's sent out to randomly selected college students or all college students if they're trying to get, an idea of how well online classes are going or something, and compare different variables to find correlations. Quasi experiments are a little bit more like fine-tuned, if you will, right? They're standing outside of churches, finding people who walk by certain areas, finding people who are having plastic surgery or not. So they're using more techniques to find individuals to meet their independent variable, not just surveying a group of people and then looking for correlations in everybody, if that makes sense. But the line here is very blurry, hard to differentiate sometimes between quasi experiments and correlational studies, especially independent group designs. Okay, so that's the first part of this chapter. I think I'm actually going to stop the PowerPoint here, and I'm going to do the small end designs as a separate PowerPoint, just so this doesn't get too long. So you can watch this lecture, and then I'll post the next lecture as well in a little bit here. Okay.